They came to harvest. They crossed the border certain. They left under escort. The fleet crossed the dark at the edge of the human system on a schedule that had been set 400 years before, and it moved the way water fills a low place, without hurry and without doubt. There were 4,012 vessels in the harvest column, and every one of them had done this work before. The overseer stood at the forward glass of the flagship and watched the small white star grow from a point into a coin, and he felt nothing that could be called excitement. He had harvested 31 worlds. This would be the 32nd. His name was Vorn, and among his people a name was a ledger of finished tasks, so his name was long, and he had earned every part of it. The survey said the third world held a population of primitives who spoke in radio, killed one another for scraps of land, and owned no ships worth the word. The survey was very detailed. The survey was 400 years old. Nobody aboard thought that was a problem. The harvest ran on a cycle. A world was found, then measured, then left to ripen, then returned to. 400 years was a short nap in the life of the convocation that had ordered all of this before Vorn drew his first breath. The math of it was clean, and Vorn liked clean math. 4,000 ships, 31 clean harvests, 0 worlds that had ever refused. When a subordinate asked, as subordinates did, whether the target might have changed in 4 centuries, Vorn gave the answer the convocation had given him. Populations grow. Weapons do not appear from nothing. Continue as planned. Beside him at the glass stood his second, an officer named Ket, who had served under Vorn for 2 harvests and had learned to be useful by being quiet. Ket watched the same star and did not share the overseer's calm, though he could not have said why. It was not fear exactly, it was something closer to arithmetic. The approach numbers were good. The energy signatures from the third world were within the expected band, and yet the band was drawn from a chart 400 years stale, and Ket had spent his whole career learning that a chart and a window do not always agree. He said none of this. He was a careful second, and careful seconds survive by phrasing doubt so gently it can be ignored. Overseer, he said instead, the outer world shows heat we did not expect. Vorn did not turn from the glass. Heat is life, he said. Life is yield. Continue as planned. That was the second time in an hour the phrase had been spoken, and it would not be the last. The flagship was a cathedral of process. 1,000 crew moved through its corridors on schedules that had not changed in generations. In the harvest bays hung the collection craft, long and pale and patient, built for one task and very good at it. In the manifest bays sat the empty holds, rated for a yield of 11,000 specimens from a world of this class. And the number 11,000 was written in the operations log the way a grocer writes a delivery. There was a word among Vorn's people for what they did, and the word did not translate cleanly into anything a human would say aloud at a dinner table. The closest human word was harvest, and the humans, when they finally learned it, did not find it gentle. But that was later. On this day, at the edge of the dark, the word was simply the job. Vorn returned to his quarters that ship night and did a thing he had done before 31 harvests, which was to sit alone with the survey and read it one more time. He read the population figure. He read the note on the primitive radio. He read the line that said, "No orbital defense of any kind," and he underlined it with a claw the way his old instructor had taught him, to fix certainty in the mind. Then he did a thing he had never done before any harvest, which was to sit for a long moment with the underlined line and feel, faintly, that it was too old to underline. He dismissed the feeling. He had felt small unease before large tasks his entire life, and he had always been proven right to press on. He was proven right 31 times. He turned off the light. Somewhere ahead of him, 140 astronomical units away, on the third stone from the coin-sized sun, a duty officer at a quiet desk was looking at a screen that had just filled with 4,012 new dots, and she was not panicking, and that was the first thing about this harvest that did not match the chart. The fleet trimmed its speed and settled into the long fall toward the inner system. In the flagship's forward log, an aide entered the standard line that opened every harvest Vorn had ever led. Target acquired. Proceed to threshold. Below it, per protocol, he entered the overseer's order, and the order was 3 words, and the 3 words were the truest thing anyone aboard believed. Continue as planned. The star grew from a coin toward a lamp. 4,000 ships fell inward, certain, on the strength of a document that was 400 years old, and not one of them slowed to ask whether the world at the bottom of the well had spent those 400 years doing anything at all. The world had. The world had been busy. But the fleet did not know that, and the survey did not say it, and Vorn had underlined the wrong line. He slept well. He would not sleep well again for a long time. Confirm the count, said the manifest officer to his own board that night, out of habit, and the board confirmed 11,000 holds, empty and rated and ready. And the word ready sat there glowing in the dark like a small green promise that no one aboard had any reason yet to doubt. The formal assembly convened on the flagship 2 days before threshold, in the wide gray chamber where every harvest was ratified before it began. Vorn sat at the head. Around the ring sat the vessel masters, the manifest officers, the tender of the holds, and, near the low end where the least of them sat, an analyst named Sesh. Sesh was not important. Sesh studied signals. He had spent the transit doing the one thing his role permitted, which was listening to the third world, and what he had heard had stopped him sleeping. He had asked, through 3 layers of superiors, for 4 minutes of the assembly's time. He had been granted 2. When his turn came, he stood, and he did not waste the 2 minutes on courtesy. Masters, he said, the survey is wrong. Not incomplete, wrong. The chamber did not gasp, because Vorn's people did not gasp. But the stillness changed quality, the way a room changes when someone says a thing that is true and unwelcome at once. Explain, said Vorn, and gave him the 2 minutes. Sesh had built his case out of numbers, because numbers were the only thing the assembly respected. The survey, he said, recorded the third world emitting radio in a narrow band, the crude shout of a young species. That was 400 years ago. For the first 300 years after the survey, the shouting grew louder, exactly as expected. Then, he said, it stopped. Not all at once. Over about 40 years, the loud, crude shouting faded, and the world went, by the old measure, quiet. The assembly heard the word quiet and relaxed, because quiet sounded like decline, and decline sounded like a soft harvest. But that, said Sesh, is the mistake. He put up the second number. The world was not quiet. The world had moved its talking into signals so tight and so clean that the old survey gear read them as silence. A species does not go from shouting to whispering in tight beams by accident. It does it on purpose. It does it when it has learned that shouting into the dark is dangerous. Ket, at Vorn's right, felt the arithmetic in his chest tighten. He said nothing. He was a careful second. Sesh pressed on into his final minute. The heat, he said. The outer worlds of this system show engineered heat where the survey shows cold rock. They have built out there. They have been building for a long time. Masters, I am not saying the harvest will fail. I am saying the survey we are trusting is 400 years old, and everything I can measure says the target used those 400 years, and we are about to cross a threshold on the strength of a document older than anyone in this room. Give me 30 days to listen closer. That is all I ask. Then Sesh sat down because his 2 minutes were spent, and the chamber turned, as chambers do, to the one whose name was longest. Vorn did not answer right away. He looked at the young analyst for a moment longer than was comfortable, and in that moment Ket believed briefly that the overseer would grant the 30 days. Then Vorn spoke, and his voice was not cruel, and that was the worst part of it. Analyst, he said, you have described a species that learned to be quiet. Quiet is not the same as armed. You have described building. Building is not the same as fighting. You have measured signals you do not understand and concluded they are dangerous because you do not understand them. That is not analysis. That is fear wearing the clothes of analysis. He let the room absorb it. Then he said the thing that would be quoted bitterly for the rest of the campaign, and quoted again long after in a language he did not yet know existed. A species that has gone silent, said Vorn, has gone silent because it is afraid. We do not slow down for the afraid. We harvest them. It was, Ket thought, a very good line. It was also completely wrong, and Ket knew it was wrong the way you know a stair is missing in the dark, in the body before the mind. Sesh made one last attempt. He rose halfway and said, "Overseer, at least send the request to the convocation. Let them decide whether 30 days is worth it." And Vorn, to close the matter cleanly, did exactly that because process was process. The request went up the long dark to the convocation, worded with perfect courtesy, asking for authority to delay the harvest 30 days for reassessment. The answer came back 9 hours later, and it was the same answer the convocation had given to every hesitation in 400 years of harvest. Populations grow. Weapons do not appear from nothing. Continue as planned. Vorn read it aloud to the assembly, and the assembly took it as a verdict, and the assembly was ratified, and the harvest was law. Sesh filed his objection into the record, because the record was the only weapon a low analyst had, and the record was carried forward, unread, into the holds of a fleet that was already committing to the fall. What none of them understood, what not one master in that gray ring had allowed himself to hear, was that the analyst had not been early, he had been late. The thing he was warning them about had already noticed them, 2 days before, at a quiet desk, on the third stone from the sun, where a woman had watched 4,000 dots appear and had picked up a telephone instead of screaming. The assembly ended. The vessel masters returned to their ships. The order stood, and the order could not be unmade now, and Ket walked the long corridor back to the glass and looked at the growing lamp of the sun and thought a thought he would never say aloud until the whole thing was over. He thought, we should have given him the 30 days. The fleet crossed the threshold at the 9th hour of the harvest first day, and Vorn's confidence was at its peak, because a threshold crossed is a decision made, and decisions made were the thing he was best at. The threshold, in the fleet's own charts, was the wide invisible line where the sun's wind gave way to the true dark between stars, and crossing it had meant, on 31 worlds, that the difficult part was over and the harvest could begin. It was, though no officer aboard would have used the word, a border. Nobody asks permission to cross a border they do not believe belongs to anyone. The forward vessels reported the crossing in the flat language of routine. Threshold passed. No response. Continue as planned. The words rolled up through the fleet and up to Vorn on the flagship, and he received them the way a man receives the sound of his own house settling, as proof that the world was as he had left it. But the words, no response, were not true. There had been a response. It had simply been so quiet and so unlike anything in the survey that the forward vessels had logged it as nothing. When the harvest column crossed the line, 41 objects that the fleet had catalogued as dead rock, drifting in the dark at the system's edge, had turned very slightly, all at once, to face the incoming ships. They did not fire. They did not signal. They turned the way a sleeper's head turns toward a sound. And then they held still, and the fleet, reading its 400-year chart, saw dead rock where a wide-open eye had just opened. This was, though none of them understood it yet, the moment the harvest was already lost. Far ahead on the third world, in a low concrete room under a mountain, in a country that had spent 100 years learning to hide things under mountains, a woman named General Sara Ruiz stood in front of a wall of screens and watched the 41 eyes report back that the intruders had crossed the line. She was not a large woman, and she did not raise her voice. She had been given command of a thing that had no name in any budget, a thing that 3 generations of quiet people had built for exactly this and hoped never to use. Her staff waited for the word. Every screen in the room waited for the word. And General Ruiz looked at 4,012 dots falling toward everything she had ever loved. And she said the word that would define her. And the word was, not yet. Not yet, she said again, softer, when a young officer's hand drifted toward a console. We only get one first look at us. We do not spend it early. Confirm the count. The count was confirmed, 4,012. She wrote it on a whiteboard with a marker that was going dry because the room's supply request had been stuck in procurement for 6 weeks. And she underlined it twice, and the marker squeaked, and that small, dry squeak was the loudest sound in the room. Out at the edge, the first small encounter of the harvest was already happening, and it did not happen the way the survey said it would. A collection craft, running ahead of the column to scout the outer belt, found what its crew took to be a primitive mining vessel, a slow, ugly thing of welded metal crewed by a single life sign. The collection craft did what collection craft do. It signaled the mining vessel to hold position and prepare for boarding in the standard harvest tongue on the standard harvest band. Aboard the ugly welded ship, a 58-year-old ice miner named Marcus Holt heard a burst of noise on a channel that had never carried noise in the 11 years he had worked the belt, and he did not understand a word of it, and he understood all of it. He had been briefed once, years ago, by a bored man in a bad suit on what to do if this ever happened. He did the thing. He did not run because running told them your top speed. He did not fight because fighting told them your weapons. He reached over and shut off his transponder, cut his engines, and went dark and silent and still, one small, ugly ship pretending to be a rock among rocks. And he sat there in the cold with his hand on a cross his mother had given him, and he did not comply. The collection craft signaled again. Nothing answered. It moved closer, annoyed, and found only cold metal and no life sign, because Holt had killed his heat too, learned from the same bored man, and the craft's crew logged a malfunctioning derelict and moved on, and never knew that the derelict watched them pass and quietly counted them and sent, in a tight, clean beam that read as silence, the exact number and heading of the column's leading edge to a mountain 100 astronomical units away. It was, in the end, the first act of the war, and it was performed by a man with a bad back and a dry sandwich, who never told anyone he had done it, including later when they offered to put his name on a wall. Back at the column's edge, the routine held for 6 more hours. Then a scout vessel, ranging ahead through the belt on a standard sweep, reported an anomaly, then reported it was investigating, then reported nothing at all. It simply stopped reporting, mid-transmission, on a word that was never finished. The fleet's board showed the scout's light, and then it showed the scout's light flicker, and then the scout's light was not there. No explosion, no distress, no wreckage on the sensors. A ship that had been a light was now in absence, and the operations officer stared at the absence and did the thing he was trained to do, which was to assume malfunction, and log it as such and continue as planned. But he stared at the absence a moment too long, and on the flagship, when the routine summary of the day reached Vorn, buried in the middle of 40 lines of nothing, there was one line that was not nothing, and Vorn read it, and Vorn did not read the next line. He read the one line 3 times, then he read it again. One scout unrecovered, cause unknown. He told himself it was a malfunction. He was very good at telling himself things. Confirm the count of the column, he said to the officer of the watch, out of a habit he did not examine. The count was confirmed, 4,011. Under the mountain, the room that had no name in any budget was the plainest room in the war. The floor was gray. The chairs did not match. There was a coffee machine that had produced, for 9 years, coffee that everyone agreed was bad and nobody replaced, because replacing it would have required a form. And the people in this room had a complicated relationship with forms. General Ruiz stood at the dry whiteboard and gave the honest number, because she had learned long ago that the honest number, spoken early, is worth more than any speech. 4,012 ships, she said. We have taken one. That leaves them 4,011. She let it sit. And to answer the question I can see on your faces, she went on, no, we do not have 4,000 ships. We do not have 400. What we have is 100 years of a promise made by people who are all dead now, and I intend to keep it. The promise had a history, and she told exactly one paragraph of it, because that was all the moment could carry. 100 years ago, she said, we heard something cross our sky that should not have been there, and it went away, and it left a shadow, and a very small number of frightened, stubborn people decided we would never be surprised in our own house again. They did not build a fleet because we could not build a fleet in secret. They built other things. They built the eyes at the edge. They built the quiet ways of talking. They built the tools for turning a whole species into one weapon on one day's notice. And they built it under mountains and under oceans, and under the ordinary work of ordinary people who thought they were building something else. That is what we have. It is not a fleet. It is worse than a fleet if we are patient. The build timeline was on the wall behind her, and it was brutal in its honesty. Full mobilization of the hidden network would take 9 days. The intruders would reach the inner system in 11. 2 days of margin. 2 days between ready and dead. She did not soften it. 9 days, she said. We have 11. We do not spend the difference on nerves. In the corner of the room, at a console that monitored the outer relays, sat the ordinary worker of this story, a relay technician named Danny Osei, 34 years old, who had taken this job because it was steady and paid for his daughter's asthma medicine, and had, until 2 days ago, involved nothing more dramatic than swapping failed circuit boards on a graveyard shift. Danny was not in any plan. Danny had no rank that mattered, and when the relay he was watching began to fail, one of the 41 eyes at the edge losing its link because a fleet was now close enough to wash it in noise, Danny did the small thing that no one had ordered and no one would remember to thank him for. He rerouted the eye's feed through a backup path that the manuals said was too slow to use, hand typing the addresses from memory because the automated system had already given up. And he kept the eye alive for another 19 hours. And those 19 hours of vision were the reason the mountain saw the column split into 3 prongs before it happened instead of after. He did it in about 4 minutes. Then he went back to his other screens, and he never mentioned it. And when someone finally noticed months later and asked him about it, he said he figured somebody would want the feed, and that was all he ever said about it, then or ever. General Ruiz spent that night doing the things steady leaders do, which is nothing, visibly, so that everyone else can rest. She walked the room. She refilled the bad coffee. She stopped at the desk of the young officer whose hand had drifted toward the console at the threshold. And she did not scold him. She asked him his sister's name, and she remembered it, and she moved on. In her pocket, she carried a small, worn photograph she never showed anyone, of a man and a boy at a lake. And the man was her father, and the boy was her son, and both of them were gone now. One to age, and one to a war that had nothing to do with this one. And she carried the photograph the way Marcus Holt carried the cross, as a private argument against giving up. Near midnight, her deputy asked her the question the whole room was asking. "General," he said quietly, "they are 4,000 and we are hiding under a rock. When do we hit them?" And Ruiz looked at the board, at the 3 prongs of light falling toward her world, and she gave the answer that was already becoming the second half of her name. "Not yet," she said. And when he waited, she gave him the reason. Because he had earned a reason. "We get exactly 1 moment," she said, "when they still believe the survey. 1 moment when they walk in the door, certain we are livestock. Everything we have is built for that 1 moment. If we spend it early, out here in the dark where they can run, we teach them we are dangerous, and we get nothing for the lesson. We wait until they are all the way inside. We wait until running costs them more than fighting. Then we speak." She capped the dry marker. Confirm the count, she said one more time before she let herself sit down. And the count came back 4,010, because a second scout had gone into the belt, curious about the first, and had not come out. And Ruiz nodded once, and she did not smile, because she had also just watched, on the same board, one of her own edge eyes go permanently dark. And she made herself a quiet promise she would not repeat to anyone, that when this was done, she would learn the name of every person that dark eye had carried, and she would say each one out loud. Not yet, she said to herself, in the empty part of the night. Not yet, but soon. Attrition is a slow word for a slow kind of dying, and the fleet died slowly at first, in ones, in a way that was easy to explain and impossible to stop. On the fourth day of the harvest, a supply tender lost power in the belt and was found, hours later, drifting cold, its crew alive, but its engines fused into slag by something that had left no mark of impact, as if the ship had simply been persuaded to stop. On the fifth day, 2 collection craft that had gone into a dense field to scout a large iron body reported that the body was hollow, reported that the body was not a body, and then reported the way the scouts had reported, which was to stop. On the sixth day, the count that Vorn confirmed each night was 4,003, and the missing 9 were spread thin enough across 6 days that each one, alone, was a malfunction, an accident, a thing that happens to fleets, and only together did they make a shape. And Vorn would not look at the shape. Ket looked at it. Ket looked at it every night. "Overseer," said Ket on the 6th night, in the most survivable phrasing he owned, "we have lost 9 vessels to causes we have not identified. On 31 harvests we lost, in total, 4, and all 4 to known accidents. I am not drawing a conclusion. I am putting the 2 numbers next to each other." Vorn heard the 2 numbers next to each other, and he understood exactly what Ket was too careful to say, and because he understood it, he refused it. 9 ships out of 4,000, he said, is a rounding error in a campaign this size. A belt is a dangerous place. We are not the first fleet to lose ships in rock. Confirm the count and stand your watch. But that night, alone, Vorn did a thing that would have astonished the assembly. He pulled the analyst's filed objection out of the record, the one that had been carried unread into the holds, and he read all of it, every measured line. And he found that the analyst had predicted, in dry language, exactly this. A species that has learned to be quiet, Sesh had written, will not meet you where you are strong. It will let you into a place where you are slow, and it is fast. And it will take you apart in pieces small enough to be mistaken for accidents. And by the time you count the pieces, you will already be too far in to leave cheaply. Vorn read it 3 times. Then he read it again. He did not send for the analyst. He was not yet ready to be a man who sent for the analyst. Instead, he did the thing the fleet had always done with doubt, which was to hand it upward. He composed, in perfect courtesy, a message to the convocation. 9 vessels lost to unidentified causes in the outer belt, he wrote. Pattern inconsistent with accident. Requesting authority to consolidate the column and reduce dispersal pending assessment. It was a modest request. It asked for almost nothing. He sent it into the long dark and he waited. And 9 hours later the answer came back. And it was the answer he already knew, because it was the only answer the convocation had ever given. Populations grow. Weapons do not appear from nothing. Continue as planned. He read it aloud to no one. Then he did a strange thing, a thing he had never done. He sent a second message. He was more direct this time, which for Vorn was a kind of confession. Losses now number 9 and rising, he wrote. I have read the survey analyst's objection. He predicted this pattern precisely. I asked the convocation to consider that the survey is 400 years old and the target may be defended, requesting reassessment. He sent it, and this second act of doubt cost him something to send, and 9 hours later the answer came, and the answer was, word for word, the same. Populations grow. Weapons do not appear from nothing. Continue as planned. Vorn sat with the identical words a long time. He understood in that moment a thing that no harvest had ever taught him. The convocation was not reading his messages. The convocation had a reply for hesitation, and it sent the reply the way a machine sends a receipt, and it had been sending that same reply into that same dark for 400 years to every officer who had ever felt a floor tilt. And most of those officers had been wrong, and so the reply had always been right, and so the reply would keep being sent long after it had stopped being true. That was the thing about the convocation that never translated into a briefing. Meanwhile, the losses did their quiet work on the crews, which is the second front of attrition, the one that no count captures. Ships that had never lost a vessel now lost them weekly. Crews that had boarded 31 worlds without a scratch now checked their locks. In the mess halls, the talk changed, not into panic, because Vorn's people did not panic, but into the low, careful talk of people doing arithmetic they have been told not to do. A collection pilot named Zell, young and fast and certain he was the only decisive one aboard, listened to that low talk and drew from it the exact wrong lesson, and began, quietly, to plan a thing that would make everything worse, but that was still to come. On the seventh night, Vorn stood at the forward glass, where the sun was no longer a lamp, but a true sun now, close enough to warm the glass, and he looked at the third world, a small blue point among the inner planets, ordinary as any world he had ever taken, and he found that it did not look ordinary anymore. He could not have said what had changed. The point was the same point, but he had stood at this glass before 31 worlds, and none of them had ever looked back, and this one, somehow, did. Confirm the count, he said, without turning, because the ritual was the only steady thing left. The officer of the watch confirmed it. The count was 3,998. 14 ships now. And down in the manifest bay, out of habit, out of a faith that was beginning to curdle, the tender of the holds ran his own confirmation, and his board still glowed with the same green promise it had glowed with at the edge of the dark. 11,000 holds, empty and rated and ready, and the tender looked at the word ready for a long moment. And for the first time in his career, the word looked less like a promise and more like a question. The wall that beat the fleet was not a weapon, it was a shield, and the humans could not get through it. And for 6 days that failure lived in a basement room that was even worse than the room under the mountain. This room was under a university, and it smelled of old carpet and burned coffee, and it held 9 people and a whiteboard and a problem that was killing them. The problem was simple to state. The intruder ships carried a screen, a field that turned aside every kinetic strike humanity threw at them, and humanity's entire hidden strategy depended on the one day when it would strike all at once. And if the screen held, the one day would be a slaughter, and the slaughter would be ours. The 9 people in the basement were the problem solvers, and they were not geniuses, and they would spend the rest of their lives correcting anyone who called them that. They were a plasma physicist named Priya Rao, a retired naval engineer named Tom Byrne, who had been pulled out of a fishing town for this, 2 graduate students who mostly made the coffee, a mathematician who did not speak much, and 4 others whose names never made the histories at all. For 5 days they attacked the screen the way everyone attacks a wall, head on, harder each time, more power, sharper strikes, and for 5 days the screen turned everything aside, and the modeling said it would keep turning everything aside until humanity ran out of everything. On the 5th night, Tom Byrne fell asleep in his chair and woke at 3 in the morning with the specific misery of a man who has slept in a chair, and he stood up to get the bad coffee, and he stood at the whiteboard instead, looking at the wall of failed math, and he said the sentence that won the war, and he said it to an empty room because everyone else was asleep. "We have been thinking about it wrong," he said. He woke Priya. He woke the students. He drew a bad circle on the board and tapped it. "We keep trying to punch through the screen," he said. "The screen is built to turn aside a punch. That is the one thing it is good at. So stop punching. He drew a second bad circle. Every field like this has to breathe, he said, in the plain language of a man who had spent 40 years around real machines. It has to let energy in and out, or it cooks the ship it protects. There is a rhythm to it, a window. It is not a wall. It is a door that is almost always closed. And a door that is almost always closed, he said, opens sometimes. Priya, who understood the deep math Tom only felt in his hands, went to the board and started to write. And the quiet mathematician woke up and started to write. And by dawn they had it. Not a way to break the screen, but a way to listen to it. To read the rhythm of its breathing and fire in the fraction of a second when the door was open. And it required no more power at all, only patience and timing, which were the two things humanity had been building under mountains for 100 years. They had no captured emitter to test it on, because everything the Edge Eyes had stopped was 100 astronomical units away and would stay there, so they built one, in the basement, out of nothing but the telemetry the Eyes had pulled off the first crippled tender, and it breathed exactly the way Tom Burns' hands had said it would. They fired a strike timed to the breath. The screen turned aside 1,000 strikes and let the 1,001st pass clean, and the target behind it, an old block of steel, rang like a bell and split. 9 people in a bad room watched a block of steel split and did not cheer, because they understood, all at once, exactly what it meant and exactly what it would cost. And Priya sat down on the floor because her legs had decided they were done. The breakthrough went up to the mountain in a tight, clean beam, and General Ruiz read it standing up, and she read it 3 times, and then she did the only thing that mattered, which was to give it to the fleet without letting the fleet know it had been given. The timing solution was loaded, quietly, into the guidance of every hidden strike platform across the system, and no shot was fired because it was not the day yet. And the whole terrible power of it was kept sheathed because a weapon revealed is a weapon answered. Ruiz made exactly one exception, and she made it with her eyes open, over the objection of half the room. A solution that has only ever worked in a basement is a rumor, she said, and I am not staking 100 years on a rumor. She set the terms of the exception herself. 1 craft, 1 shot, far enough out that the fleet would read it as one more thing it could not explain, and late enough that there would be no time left to build an answer to it. On the 9th night of the harvest, a lone collection craft ranging near the inner belt was struck, once, cleanly, through a full screen, by a strike that its own instruments swore should have been turned aside. And the craft did not die instantly, and its crew had 11 seconds to send one message before the cold took them. And the message they sent, in 11 confused seconds, was the message that finally reached Vorn in words he could not file as malfunction. They went through the screen, the message said. They went through the screen like it was not there. And when a recovery vessel reached the wreck hours later, the crew that boarded it found a hole in the hull that was clean and small and precise, threaded through the exact center of a screen that had been at full power. And they stood around the hole and looked at it and did not have a word for it, because their people had built the screen and had believed for 400 years that no one else could. The recovery captain reported the wreck to the flagship in the flattest language he could manage, and he attached an image of the small, clean hole. And he ended his report with a line that was not in any manual, a line that was pure human in its plainness, though he did not know he was echoing an enemy he had never met. I do not know how this happened, he wrote. I know that it did. Vorn looked at the image of the small, clean hole for a long time. He understood the screen. He had trusted the screen his whole life. He understood now that someone had learned to open it, quietly, without ever telling him they could, and had chosen this one wreck to let him find out. Confirm the count, he said, and his voice was not quite steady, and the count was 3,981. And Vorn set down the image and said, to Ket, to himself, to the dark, a sentence that would end up carved, years later, on a monument he would never see. "I know what that is," he said. "I did not know they had it." The day the fleet had waited 11 days for, the humans had waited 100 years for, and when it came all at once, in the space of a single hour, over the blue world, in the light of an ordinary morning. The fleet reached the inner system at the 10th hour and did what it had done 31 times. It fanned into harvest formation above the third world, collection craft moving in their thousands to their assigned altitudes, holds open, screens up, certain to the last of their arithmetic that below them lay a frightened, quiet, defenseless yield. The survey said no orbital defense of any kind. Vorn had underlined that line. It was the last thing he trusted. And then the harvest began, exactly the way it had begun on 31 worlds before it. The collection craft came down through an ordinary morning into their assigned lanes, and the holds opened, and in the first hour they lifted 1,100 people off the surface of the blue world. Under the mountain, the board showed every lift as it happened, one small light after another rising off a map of towns. A young officer said out loud that they had to move now. General Ruiz said, "Not yet." She said it in the same flat voice she had used at the threshold, and on every night since, and it cost her more this time than it had ever cost her. And every person in that room understood exactly what she was spending and exactly what she was buying with it. Nobody argued. One of them went out into the corridor and was sick and came back and sat down and said nothing. And nobody looked at him because there was nothing to say that was not already on the board. Then the last of the columns settled into its assigned altitude and the formation closed. And there was no longer a door anywhere in the system that the fleet could run out of. And then the blue world, which had been quiet for 400 years, stopped being quiet. It began as everything in this story began, with one small, ordinary act. Under the mountain, General Ruiz looked at the board, at a whole harvest fleet finally, completely, irreversibly inside the door, at holds open, and screens breathing on the rhythm 9 tired people had learned to read. And she picked up the dry marker, and she wrote one word, and she said it out loud, and the word was, "Now." "Now," she said, and 100 years of hidden work answered her at once. Across the system, in places no survey had ever seen, the dead rock woke up. The 40 eyes still living at the edge became 40 gun platforms and turned inward to sit across the road home. The hollow iron bodies in the belt split open and were not bodies but batteries. And under the oceans of the blue world, hatches that had been sealed for 30 years opened, and from beneath the waves rose the things 100 years of frightened, stubborn people had built instead of a fleet. And they rose fast, and they rose everywhere, and they fired on the breath of the screens, through the doors that were almost always closed, in the one fraction of a second when the doors were open. The first volley took 900 ships, 900 in 4 seconds. The fleet's board, which had counted losses in ones for 11 days, tried to count this and could not, and simply went white. On the flagship, every alarm that existed sounded at once, and then most of them stopped, because the systems that sounded them were gone. Vorn was thrown against the forward glass by the first strike, and he pushed himself up and looked out, and the space above the blue world that had been full of his ships was full of light, and it took him a moment to understand that the light was his ships. "Confirm the count," he said, into a bridge that was screaming, out of the only habit he had left, and no one answered, because the officer whose job it was to confirm the count was dead. Down below, the strikes came in waves, timed, patient, merciless. A collection craft would raise its screen, and the screen would hold against 1,000 things, and then one thing would come through it clean, and the craft would be gone. There was no way to stop it, because the humans were not hitting the screen, they were waiting for it. And a screen cannot stop being a screen without cooking the ship it protects. So the fleet's own shields, its proudest defense, became the metronome by which it was destroyed. Ket reached Vorn through the smoke, and the two of them stood at the glass, the overseer and the careful second, and watched. Ket did not say, "I told you." He had never said it. He said the only thing left to say. "Overseer," he said, "orders." And Vorn, for the first time in 32 harvests, did not have one. The young pilot Zell had an order, though, an order he had given himself. Down in a collection wing that still lived, Zell had decided, in the low talk of the mess, that the fleet was dying because the fleet was too cautious, that a decisive strike at the surface would break the enemy's will. And now, in the chaos, with no one to stop him, he did the thing that never learns. He took 9 craft down through the fire toward a human city, toward the surface, to do the harvest by force, to prove that boldness was all that had been missing. He got halfway. The system that met him was not a city's defense. It was a single automated platform that had been built by a man who was long dead and maintained for 30 years by people who had never expected to use it. And it opened Zell's 9 craft the way the analyst had said it would, in pieces. And Zell had 4 seconds at the end to understand that he had not been decisive. He had been the last thing the enemy needed to confirm their timing. And then Zell was a clean, small hole in the dark. On the flagship, Vorn finally gave an order, and it was the right order, and it was far too late. "Break off," he said. "All vessels, break off and withdraw beyond the threshold. Cease the harvest." His voice carried across what was left of the fleet, and the ships that could still hear it tried to obey, and they turned for the dark. And the dark did not let them go easily, because the humans had built for this too, had known that the moment the fleet ran would be the moment to make running expensive. They made every step out of the system cost more than every step in. The running fight out of the inner system took 2 hours, and the long crawl outward after it took 9 days more. And it did not end at the threshold, because the threshold was no longer theirs to cross. In those first 2 hours alone, the count that no one was left to confirm fell from 3,000 to 2,000 to a number that Vorn would not know until later. He stood at the glass and watched his life's work burn in the light of an ordinary morning above a world he had been told was livestock. And he did the arithmetic he had refused to do for 11 days. And the arithmetic was total. And he said, to Ket, to the glass, to the analyst he had overruled and could not reach, a single sentence that was the truest thing he had ever said. We should have given him the 30 days. The reckoning in numbers began 3 days after what was left of the fleet dragged itself out past the belt and stopped, because the humans had let it run and would not let it leave. 40 gun platforms sat silent across the road home, and the fleet hung in the cold with the threshold in front of it and no permission to cross. And it was in those 3 days that the convocation, which had returned the same 3 words for 400 years, finally, for the first time in its history, asked a question instead of giving an answer. The question came down the long dark to Vorn's flagship, and it was, in its way, more frightening than any silence. Report actual losses, it said. Report the true count. Vorn commissioned the honest assessment because there was nothing left to protect by lying, and he gave the task to Ket, and he gave Ket one instruction. Tell me the honest number, he said, all of it. Ket took 2 days and he came back with a board, and the board was the whole war in figures, and Vorn made himself read every line. Vessels committed to the harvest, 4,012. Vessels lost, 3,340. Vessels returned, 672, of which 210 would never fly again. Crew committed, 41,000. Crew lost, 31,000. Vorn read the last number and set the board down, because 31,000 was not a number anymore. It was the mess halls he had walked through. It was the low, careful talk. It was 31,000 of his own who had died on the strength of a document that was 400 years old, and a phrase that had stopped being true before any of them were born. Confirm the count, he said very quietly, and Ket confirmed it, and neither of them pretended it was a ritual now. It was a wound. The convocation convened its own assembly across the dark, and the options were laid out, and Vorn watched them be rejected one by one. And the rejection was the most honest thing the Convocation had done in 4 centuries. The first option was to return with a larger fleet and finish the harvest. It was rejected in an hour because the assessment was clear. The humans had destroyed a harvest fleet without revealing the limit of what they held, and a larger fleet was simply a larger number to feed into the same machine. The second option was to withdraw and forget the Third World, to file it as a loss and never return. It was rejected too because it was already too late to forget. The Third World had the fleet's wrecks. The Third World had the fleet's screen technology, opened and studied. The Third World had, most dangerous of all, the fleet's charts, pulled from 100 captured ships. And on those charts were 31 other worlds, and the humans now knew where every one of them was. And to withdraw and forget was to leave the door open behind you into your own house. There was a word among Vorn's people for what happens when a power stops doing a thing because of what it costs. The word was avoidance, and it was a word they had used about weaker species for 400 years. And now, in the gray assembly across the dark, the word was being used, for the first time, about themselves. The third option was to negotiate, and this option was not rejected, because there was nothing left to reject it in favor of. It was simply, terribly, all that remained. And when the assembly turned to the question of what could possibly be offered to a species that had just destroyed a harvest fleet and could now reach 31 worlds it had every reason to burn, the analyst was finally, far too late, sent for. Sesh came to the flagship, the low analyst whose 2 minutes had been the only true thing said in the first assembly, and Vorn received him alone. And Vorn did the thing that the archetype of the confident authority almost never does, which was to say the words out loud. "You were right," said Vorn. "Huh." And Sesh, who had spent 11 days watching the thing he predicted come true, did not look triumphant, because being right about a bad thing is not the same as winning, and he knew it in his bones. "I was right, Overseer," he said. "I do not feel good about it. 31,000 of ours are dead. I would trade every part of being right to have them back." He was quiet a moment, and then he said the thing that reframed the entire disaster, the thing the whole assembly needed and could not have heard from anyone with a longer name. "We keep saying the survey was old," he said. "That is not the mistake. The mistake is that we believed a thing could not change just because we were not watching it. We stopped watching them for 400 years, and we assumed that meant they stopped. They did not stop. They spent 400 years becoming the kind of people who could do what they just did. The universe does not hold still while we are not looking, Overseer. We taught ourselves that it did, because for 31 worlds it seemed to, and the lesson cost us everything on the 32nd. Vorn heard it, and it was the analyst's objection from the first assembly, grown into something larger, and Vorn understood that this was the thing that would have to be carried to the Convocation, not the loss, the lesson. He composed the message himself, and it was short, and it was the hardest thing he had ever written, and it did not ask for reinforcement, and it did not ask for withdrawal. It asked for permission to open communication with the Third World. The Convocation, which had returned the same 3 words to hesitation for 400 years, received the request. And for the first time, it did not send the 3 words. It sent instead 1 word, and the 1 word was the whole measure of how much had changed. Proceed. So Vorn opened a channel to the Blue World, on the standard harvest band, the same band on which he had once ordered a frightened ice miner to prepare for boarding. And he sent, in the plainest language the translation would carry, the sentence that no harvest fleet in 400 years had ever been required to send. "We wish to talk," he sent. And on the 3rd stone from the sun, under a mountain, in a room with a bad coffee machine, General Sara Ruiz read the 4 words come up on a screen, and she did not smile, and she said to her deputy, in a voice that was very tired and very steady, "Get me the negotiator. It is time for the other war now. the one we are worse at. The reckoning in language was conducted in the end by two people in a plain room, and the room was chosen on purpose, because General Ruiz understood that terms outlive the people who signed them, and she wanted the room to look like the truth. The humans could have staged the talks aboard a captured warship, in the wreckage of the fleet, surrounded by the proof of what they had done. They did the opposite. They brought the fleet's representatives down to the surface, under escort, to a school gymnasium in a plain town, with folding chairs and a linoleum floor and a basketball hoop cranked up to the ceiling. And they seated the delegation at a folding table. And the message of the room was unmistakable to anyone who could read it. "We did not need our finest place to beat you. We beat you from here." The human negotiator was a woman named Elena Marsh, 61 years old, a career diplomat with a plain face and a plainer voice. And she was the immovable one. And she opened by giving away everything that did not matter. She was generous. She was, the fleet delegation would later report in bewilderment, the most courteous adversary they had ever faced. She conceded the wrecks, all of them, offered to return every recoverable body of the 31,000 dead at human expense with full honor. And she meant it. She conceded the fleet's right to withdraw unmolested. She conceded safe passage, prisoner return, the lot. For 2 days she gave ground on logistics cheerfully, item after item, until the fleet delegation began to believe that the humans, having won, were soft. Then, on the third day, they reached the one item, and Elena Marsh stopped giving ground. And she did not raise her voice, and she did not move an inch. The one item was the charts. The fleet wanted the charts back, the captured charts with the 31 other worlds on them. And they wanted the humans to agree, in the terms, never to act on what those charts contained. It was, from their side, the only thing that mattered, because those charts were the fleet's whole map of its harvest. 31 worlds it had taken, and might take again. And in human hands they were 31 addresses of the guilty. And Elena Marsh said no. She said it politely. She said it 4 different ways over 4 hours. The fleet delegation, understanding at last what the one item was, did the thing that powers do when meaning is on the table, and they offered her the world. They offered technology, screen designs, drive designs, 400 years of harvest science, anything to have that one item struck from the terms. It was possibly the most generous bribe in the history of the arrangement, and Elena Marsh declined it, all of it. 4 small concessions accepted with thanks that same morning, and 1 enormous bribe refused before lunch, and she asked instead for a private room. The private room was the school principal's office, and it was where the theme of the whole thing was said out loud, once, by 2 people with no aides and no recording. Vorn had come down himself in the end, because a man who has lost 31,000 should look the winner in the eye, and he sat across a cluttered desk from Elena Marsh, under a poster about reading being fun, and he asked her the question directly. "Why the charts?" he said. "We have offered you everything. Take the science. Give us the map. What are the charts to you?" And Elena Marsh answered him plainly, because the private room was the one place plainness was allowed. "The charts are 31 worlds you harvested," she said. 31 peoples you decided were livestock because you stopped looking at them long enough to convince yourselves they could not change. You want us to promise never to act on that map. I will not, because that map is now the only record those 31 worlds have that they are not livestock, that they are addresses, that someone, someday, might knock on their door not to harvest them, but to warn them you are coming. You harvested them into silence. I am not going to help you keep them quiet." Vorn was silent a long moment. He understood, sitting under the poster about reading, that he had lost a second war in this room, a war he had not known was being fought, the war over what the story would say. He had come to take a world and reduce it to a number and a hold. And instead, he was going to leave having made that world the keeper of 31 other worlds he had wronged. He looked at Elena Marsh across the cluttered desk, And he asked one more question, and it was not a diplomat's question, it was a man's. "What do you want from us?" he said, truly. And Elena Marsh gave him the answer that would go into the terms. The answer that was the whole point. "I want you to write it down," she said. "All of it. Every world, every count, every harvest. I want the convocation to sign a record that says what you did, in your own words, in numbers you cannot later deny. Not so we can punish you. We are not going to hunt what is left of you across the dark. I want it written down because a thing that is written down cannot go quiet again. You made a whole galaxy forget it could be harvested by making its victims silent. I am going to make it remember by making you loud." Vorn signed it. He signed it in the school gymnasium, at the folding table, under the basketball hoop, with a cheap plastic pen that Elena Marsh handed him because his own had run dry. And the pen was the same cheap kind of pen that General Ruiz had underlined her count with under the mountain. And no one in the room caught the echo, but it was there. And as his final act, before the fleet was permitted to leave, and went out under human escort across the threshold it had crossed so certain of everything, Vorn did the one thing the terms did not require, and Elena Marsh had not asked for. He returned the 1,100 humans the fleet had taken, alive, every one of them, from the holds that had been built to carry 11,000, and he returned them himself, and among them, thin and blinking in the ordinary morning light, was an ice miner named Marcus Holt, who had been taken off his ugly welded ship out in the belt on the second try, days after the first craft had logged him as a derelict and moved on, and who walked down the ramp under his own power and did not say a word, and put his mother's cross back around his neck and went home. The consequences rippled outward the way consequences do, into rooms the war had never touched, and the first of those rooms belonged to other people entirely, watching from other stars. The signed record went out into the dark exactly as Elena Marsh had intended, loud, in every language the humans could translate it into, and it reached, over the following years, the 31 worlds on the captured charts, and it reached other powers too, powers that had watched the Harvest Fleet cross into the human system 4,000 strong and cross back out under Escort, and every one of those powers did the same quiet, private arithmetic. There was a species 3 stars over that had been preparing itself to survey the human system for a harvest of its own, on a comfortable schedule, and it read the signed record, and it read the number 3,340, and it read the number 31,000 dead, and it filed its survey plans in a drawer and closed the drawer very quietly and never opened it again. There was a council of older powers that had spent 10,000 years treating the smaller species of the dark as a standing crop, and it convened, and it argued, and it did not reach a conclusion, but the fact that it argued at all was the whole ripple, because it had never once, in 10,000 years, felt the need to argue about it before. Nobody celebrated any of this. The humans did not celebrate, and it is worth saying plainly why, because victory in this story was not a parade. They did not celebrate because 1,100 of their own had gone up into those holds in the hour the mountain spent waiting, and all 1,100 came home, and that did not make the hour anything other than the worst hour any of them ever sat through. A thing can be worth doing and still be the worst hour of your life. Everyone in that room learned the difference, and none of them ever needed it explained again. And when the record was signed, they learned the number the holds had been rated for, and the number was 11,000. And knowing how near that number had come to being real is not a thing anyone throws a parade about. They did not celebrate because the Edge Eyes had gone dark with their crews aboard, and General Ruiz kept the promise she had made herself in the empty part of the night, and learned the name of every person lost with every dark eye, and read each one out loud, alone, and it took her a long time, and she did not do it for an audience. They did not celebrate because the analyst who had won this whole thing was on the other side, and Sesh went home to a fleet that had lost 31,000, and he was thanked, formally, far too late, and being thanked did not bring back one of them. And he spent the rest of his life studying species that the survey said could not change, and warning powers older and prouder than his own that the universe does not hold still while you are not looking, and being, mostly, ignored, because that is the fate of the ignored analyst, which is to be right early and heard late. The quiet domestic denouement belonged, as it should have, to the ordinary worker. Danny Osai finished his rotation under the mountain and went home to a small house with a green door, and his daughter's asthma medicine was on the fridge held up by a magnet shaped like a fish, and he never told her what he had done with a backup relay path at 3 in the morning. And he went back to swapping failed circuit boards on the graveyard shift, because the job was steady and it paid. Marcus Holt went back to the belt, to his ugly welded ship, and refused every interview. And when a young officer came out once, years later, to offer to put his name on a wall for what he had done at the very start, Holt made the officer a bad cup of coffee and said, "I turned off a switch, son. Anybody would have." And he never mentioned it again. And the wall stayed blank where his name would have gone, which is how he wanted it. And here, at the end, comes the chronicler, because someone always comes at the end, years later, to ask the question the participants never asked themselves. She was a historian named Ada Cole, and she spent 4 years interviewing everyone who would speak to her. The survivors of the fleet, and the tired people of the mountain, and the 9 from the basement under the university. And she asked every one of them the same question. What was the single decision, she asked, that changed everything? She expected them to name the first volley, the 900 ships in 4 seconds, the day of the reveal. Almost none of them did. General Ruiz, old now, said the decision was not yet, said the whole war was won in the 11 days she made everyone wait, and that giving that order over and over was the hardest thing she ever did, harder than the order to fire. Priya Rao said the decision was Tom Byrne standing up at 3 in the morning to get coffee and looking at the board instead, and stop punching and thinking about it wrong. Tom Byrne said he did not decide anything. He just could not sleep in a chair. And when Ada Cole finally reached Ket, the careful second, very old, on the far side of the dark, and asked him the same question, he did not name the volley, or the weight, or the breakthrough. He named the survey. The decision that changed everything, he said, was made 400 years before any of us, when someone wrote no orbital defense of any kind, and someone else believed it forever. Everything after that was just the bill coming due. Ada Cole wrote it down, and she closed her book with it, with a line she took from the terms themselves. From the record, Elena Marsh had made the convocation sign, a line that had become, on 31 Worlds and More, a thing people said to their children about the danger of deciding a thing cannot change. They stopped watching, it went, and they called the silence proof. And Ada Cole set down her pen, the same cheap kind of plastic pen that had signed the terms and underlined the count, and she looked out a window at an ordinary sky over an ordinary town, and she thought about the fleet that had come so certain down the long dark, and she wrote the last line of the whole account, the line that everyone already knew, the line that was true from the very first hour. They came to harvest humanity. They crossed the border certain. They left under escort.